Thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk about a project that I did when I was teaching in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Western University, where we looked at the potential for immersive technology in the enhancement of anatomy education. So anatomy, by its nature, can be difficult for students to learn and understand, kind of rapidly following the previous talk, which is great. And it sort of highlights a need for advanced teaching methods and a commitment to improve students' capacity for learning. Teaching aids in anatomy are commonplace, and they can range anywhere from plastic models to prosections to cadavers. However, different challenges arise with each of these methods in terms of accessibility and feasibility as well. There leaves a space for something like an online digital tool. And can this facilitate learning specifically within anatomy? So there has been several studies done in this area before. Results have been ambiguous. Some have said, yes, this can confer learning benefits. Some have said, no, there's no extra acquisition of knowledge with these tools. So we wanted to ask whether 3D models can offer an innovative solution to enhance anatomy education. And further, can the integration of these digital models enhance the overall learning experience for our undergraduate students as related to engagement, motivation, and learning over traditional methods? And for us in this course, traditional methods was plastic anatomical models. So in terms of our methods, we looked at an undergraduate anatomy course. Okay, this is from the Faculty of Health Sciences, which includes students from kinesiology, health sciences, as well as nursing. We used an application called Visible Body. This is a digital online software where students can access from campus or from home, from their own mobile device or a desktop computer. Okay, and it has this option for augmented reality, which is the image that you're seeing in the bottom right there. And then the top images are sort of the desktop or tablet or mobile option. This is a class of almost 1,000 students. Okay, so we had 30 laboratory sections, and we divided them into 3 groups, cross-sectional or cross-divided for students within kinesiology, health sciences, and nursing. So we had some students who were only given access to plastic models, some who were only given access to Visible Body, and then some that were given access to both. Students worked through a lab activity worksheet, and then they completed a content quiz and survey at the end of that session. I have both quantitative and qualitative results. You can come and look at my poster for the qualitative. So I'm going to just show you the quantitative for now. So we did some of the RIMS instruments. So we looked at the ARC subscale. So that's attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. On the x-axis, we have the 3 treatments, so groups from the plastic models, Visible Body, as well as Visible Body and plastic in combination. And then you can see going, the y-axis, is a Likert scale, so from strongly disagree up to strongly agree. And then I've highlighted the points here. They're in green, but I didn't think they were very easy to see in green, so I've highlighted them in a circle for you as well. These suggest points that were different from those treatments with the plastic models alone, okay? And specifically, you can see on the top panel there, our attention subscale is actually separated into different faculties. So this is our health sciences, our kinesiology, as well as our nursing. I'm going to blow that up just a little bit here. So on the bottom, again, is our 3 treatments, okay? Health sciences, kinesiology, and nursing. And then if you specifically look at health sciences, this is where we're seeing our most benefit, especially in combination tools. So using the plastic models with the digital tool. So what this is suggesting is that our students who come from health sciences disciplines are finding that the addition of digital tools in their learning and studying and during an active laboratory session are feeling more engaged and having more intention to the content. This was really exciting for us. Okay? It does also suggest, though, that plastic models still have a place. So they do offer a hands-on experience that students need, okay? Especially in a course such as this, which was largely asynchronous and online. However, digital tools can be useful to fill the gaps in learning from the plastic models. They can enable students to see things that are not easily seen in plastic models. For example, deeper muscle layers. Okay? And then the combination of these tools together can have additive effects for learning and improve accessibility for all learners. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am an undergrad student here at Mac with Mac Anatomy. And today I'll be talking about our research on virtual reality as well as its effectiveness in anatomy education. So, virtual reality, otherwise known as VR, has been an emerging and exciting tool for learning anatomy. And in anatomy education, it allows students to access different specimens from the comfort of their home without ever being in a physical lab. So that does sound like the next best thing. But one question remains, does virtual reality learning actually help students to perform better in the physical test? Because after all, we don't live in a virtual reality environment. We live in the physical world. So the real question is, will students be able to apply their learning if they did everything in VR into a physical testing environment? And we want to bring in the idea of transfer appropriate processing, otherwise known as TAP, which suggests that learners would perform better in an environment where they learn from. And considering that VR is very different from the actual physical testing environment, we want to investigate whether or not student learning in either VR or the physical environment can transfer their learning into both testing environments. So how do we do this? We recruited a cohort of 89 students without prior anatomical knowledge and split them into two different arms, either using a physical model that's 3D printed or using VR. In the pretest phase, they are asked 5 anatomical questions about landmarks on a vertebra to test their baseline knowledge. And following that, in the learning phase, they are asked to memorize 15 landmarks on a 15 vertebral landmarks, and they're asked to do 2 post-tests afterward, so both in VR and using a physical model to see how their knowledge transfers to both testing environments. So what did we find out? We used repeated ANCOVA to analyze our data, and we found that there is a significant difference when we're seeing the VR arm. So there's a significant difference when comparing the post-test scores for people that did the test in a physical environment and VR. In another word, when you learn in VR and test it in a physical environment, we actually see that there is a significant decrease in post-test scores. But this is not really the case for the people that have learned using a physical 3D printed model. And what we realize is that when they're tested in physical or VR environment, their test score did not differ that significantly. So what does that mean for us? For educators, it means that you may not need to cram 400 students into a small lab room for examinations or prepare a bunch of wet specimens, because there's the possibility of doing it through VR. However, for students, you may want to consider not putting all your energy into learning in VR, as it may not be applicable for a physical testing environment. Overall, though, it goes to say that TAP may affect our learning in anatomy when looking at VR education, and VR as a learning tool does warrant more investigation before further application into anatomy education. And at last, I would just like to thank our graduate student, Farah, for helping us with the study, as well as Mac Anatomy. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how testing helps us with our ability to integrate our knowledge. So like we've been talking about, learning over long periods of time, like in a classroom or online learning, can be really hard. Students get bored, they stop paying attention. What we focus on in the lab is an obstacle called proactive interference. This is where once you've done a bit of learning, and you're now ready to tackle something new, it can be difficult to encode that new information because it competes with similar knowledge we already have. But if you ask students to test themselves after learning something we call interpolated testing, before moving on to learning something new, they remember a lot more. And this is because they're able to keep these little pockets of learning separate and unique. But it raises the question that if we're keeping aspects of our learning separate, can we then bring it back together at the very end? To answer this question, we recruited 151 undergraduate participants from Toronto Metropolitan University, and we asked them to learn 3 word lists in anticipation of 2 final cumulative tests, where they'd be asked to remember every single word they had learned during the experiment twice. In these word lists, they were made up of 15 words that were taken from 5 semantic categories that were the same across lists. So for example, if a category animal was on all lists, it would mean that there were 3 animal words on the first list, 3 different animal words on the second list, and 3 different animal words on the third list. After learning a list, participants were asked to do one of 3 things. The test condition were immediately recalling the words that they had just learned. The restudy condition were studying the words again. And the control condition were doing a completely unrelated task, in this case, solving math problems. After this, half of the participants did their first final cumulative test after just a short 5-minute delay. And the other half did this same test after a bit longer 20-minute delay. This was all repeated on their second cumulative test. What we were interested in measuring were, first, how many words do they remember? But also, how likely are they to group these related words together during their recall, a phenomenon that we call semantic organization. So to orient ourselves on the results, the y-axis is the percentage of correct recall. The x-axis is our conditions. The darker colors represent students who had that short delay before their first test. Lighter colors had that longer delay. And the bars are telling us the distribution of that data for each of the conditions. So taking that together, what we see is that testing and restudy were both superior in their memory compared to controls at both delays. And this is interesting because it tells us that just simple re-exposure to the words was helpful at this shorter 5 or 20-minute time frame. But this may not be super surprising, given that testing tends to show benefits above and beyond restudy at these longer time intervals, like hours or days. Looking at this second test, what we see is that recall stays pretty consistent. The amount that you remember on the first test, you're likely to also remember on your second test. But in semantic organization, the tested condition was differentiated from restudy and controls, meaning that they were more frequently grouping related words together on that very first test. And it implies that they're making meaningful connections between these words through the use of these intermittent tests along the way. But what's really exciting is that after exposure to that very first test, everyone shows organizational improvements on that second test. And it happens again across both delays, meaning that everybody's benefiting from this first test and starting to notice these connections between related words almost immediately. So coming back to our initial question, yes, testing can boost knowledge integration during our learning, as well as helping us to keep aspects of our learning separate. And this is important for areas like learning and education, where successful learning not only depends on our ability to build knowledge, but also make meaningful connections in order to organize that knowledge and make it fit together.
Good morning. I suspect this is a kind of pretty familiar experience that you're working really hard on a problem. Maybe it's a research problem or a problem that exists somewhere else in your life, and you get stuck. You're reaching some kind of an impasse, and then perhaps you go off and do something else. Get some exercise, take a break. For me, sometimes it happens cutting the grass or doing some vacuuming, and suddenly you're able to make some progress. Maybe you get an answer. Maybe you actually solve the problem. This is what I mean about making progress without conscious effort. So what I'm interested in this particular work is figuring out whether or not we can exploit that kind of a scenario, tapping into, if you like, recruiting non-conscious elements, fringe consciousness, completely non-conscious possibilities to actually make progress in a learning context. Now, I'm involved in teaching a lot of physical science courses at York. These are often very large classes, and I'm teaching non-majors. So they're out of their comfort zone. Some of them are there under duress. And, this is typically a general education requirement. So what we're trying to do is engage the students in various ways. And one of the ways that I do that is by giving them what I call self-directed field work. So in a weather and climate course, what they do is take photographs of clouds, which they'll subsequently classify. And what I've recently started doing is while the students are actually engaged in this kind of first lab of capturing these pictures, which they'll then spend time, trying to figure out, is this a cumuliform style cloud or something else? I have them capture questions that occur to them. They're not supposed to filter the questions. They capture basic metadata, data about data, date, time, and context. And then in a subsequent lab, what I have them do is go back and look at the context and make some kind of a assessment as to how proximal to consciousness they were when they were capturing that particular question. And what I find is that when we go in through the analysis part of this second lab, and the students are asked to classify their questions first according to the revised version of Bloom's taxonomy, they get some pretty surprising results. And if we then have them, in addition to classifying according to the Bloom's level, the degree of conscious recruitment that they self-reported, things get even more interesting. And that's what this matrix is all about. And what's really appealing about this is that the students are quite often very, very surprised by the results. Now, they struggle a bit with the Bloom's taxonomy classifications. We are able to leverage standard kind of evaluation schemes that have been used well, in kind of a fairly well-worn path in the geosciences. But what I also have them do is I teach them how to prompt generative AI tools like ChatGPT and Google Gemini to get a second opinion on classifying their questions according to the Bloom's taxonomy. This seems to work fairly well. So here's really why I'm quite excited about taking an approach like this. I think we all know how important the proximity to consciousness is in terms of the creative process. This model is due to Graham Wallace back almost 100 years ago now. This is a slightly updated version due to Sadler Smith. And again, I'm sure we've all had experience with the creative process, and you know how important the fringe and the non-conscious components are. So what I'm trying to do is use these questions as a means to trying to recruit, if you like. That's my own use of word here. I'm looking forward to a lot of feedback from the conference to try and kind of tap into these areas of consciousness that are a little bit more distal to the fully engaged consciousness phase. So what I'm finding in terms of the results, and I've got much more data in the presentation, is that we do see evidence in the students' questions that they are getting into some of these other areas of fringe and non-conscious grades of consciousness. Getting the students to ask the questions seems to be very good in terms of helping them to also ask questions. Students aren't great at asking questions. I can show you my Moodle site to prove that anytime. Yet as scientists, we realize how important questions are. It's an absolutely fundamental part of the process. Asking more questions seems to help the students dig deeper into or higher, if you like, into the Bloom's taxonomy and get to more interesting questions. So that seems to be a positive thing. And as I say, I'm very interested in trying to make these connections between tapping these sort of less conscious elements to see if that, what we know to be important in the creative process, can also help in the learning process. Thank you.
So as we go about our day, the contents of our thoughts are constantly changing. This fluctuation of our cognitive states is perfectly normal, and of course would apply to students in educational settings. Although generally educators want to encourage students to engage with the lecture contents to their best capacity, as we believe that greater attentional focus indicates greater academic success, it is inevitable that students might be thinking of different things here and there. Some of these thoughts are task-related, whereas some other ones are unrelated to our lecture contents, which are commonly studied within the domain of mind-wandering. So mind-wandering is defined as shift in attention from an external task at hand towards internally generated cognition. It has great implications for a bunch of our cognitive processes, such as learning, memory, or our downstream task performance. Findings on mind wandering have been sort of inconsistent between the lab and in the real world. So in the real world, we generally see a lower prevalence of mind wandering. And instead of a linear increase over time, we sort of see a flatter trend or even a drop of mind wandering towards the end of lecture. Perhaps more importantly, not all forms of mind wandering were found to be detrimental to learning. Elaborative off-task thinking, for example, might actually be beneficial to learning. So this sort of inconsistency highlights the importance of understanding attentional states beyond whether someone is on or off task and looking into the nuanced characteristics behind off-task thoughts. So in our work, we're going to use a powerful thought-probing tool, multidimensional experience sampling, MDES, that asks individuals to report on 16 different dimensions of thinking, including things like modality, emotion, or focus. This allows us to gauge which of these dimensions would cluster together to produce the dominant patterns of thinking across different contexts. So for example, detailed deliberate thinking, which might be predicting students' academic performance down the line. So taken together, to holistically understand students' academic performance, in our work, we're taking an approach that concurrently assesses students' cognition in lecture, their cognition across various activities in their daily life, while considering their well-being, such as symptoms of anxiety or depression, which I will not be focusing on today. So specifically for students' cognition in lecture, we programmed an app, Probe app, that students can download onto the laptop that they regularly bring to lecture. And throughout an entire semester, prior to the start of a lecture, Probe app sends them prompts asking for their expectations. So that includes how interesting, how difficult, or how much distraction would you expect. Throughout a lecture, periodically, Probe app also sends prompts asking them to report their level of engagement, as well as the slide content that they're currently viewing. And right after some lectures, we're also asking participants to answer MDES to give us a sense of their thought patterns in lecture. As for students' cognition in daily life, we're using a smartphone app called Samply Research that periodically throughout the day asks participants to report their primary activity like eating or resting, their current environment, as well as their thought patterns associated with the context. So I hope that our approach can help understand the intricate cognitive states that influence learning during lectures and across various contexts in students' daily life. So far, we have recruited over 200 undergraduate participants who provided us with thousands of data on their cognitive states across various contexts. And with this, we were able to characterize the nuanced thinking states behind learning in lecture, which are things like future planning or detailed deliberate. And every time when a student responds to a thought probe in their daily life, we can map that onto the dominant thought patterns we found in lecture. So for example, if a student's thought is somewhat low on detailed deliberate, meaning that it's vague and it's spontaneous, and also being neutral on positive intrusive, meaning that it's neutral in emotion and not necessarily disruptive, their thought can be placed around there. So in our data, we see that these are thoughts students reported while resting or doing nothing in their daily life. We found that the dominant thought patterns we found were actually predictive of students' grades. So for example, if a student's thinking were to become more detailed deliberate, their performance on labs tend to get better. And the relative distance between the thoughts obtained from different contexts also matter. So for example, resting being close to doing nothing means that they share similar thinking patterns, and we can fill the space with all the activities we had measured. Here we saw that the stability of students' cognition across different contexts might be predicting their academic performance. So using learning-related activities, being in lecture and doing homework in daily life as an example, we can look at the similarity between their thought patterns, which I'm plotting on the x-axis, and how that's related to grades. Here, very interestingly, we saw that students who tend to think similarly, so share the similar thought patterns in these two contexts, also tend to perform better academically. So overall, I hope that our work can help highlight the importance of one, understanding attentional states beyond whether someone is on or off task, and looking into the nuanced features behind these off-task thoughts, And 2, considering students' academic experience beyond the lecture hall and across various activities in their daily life. Thank you.